Chapter 20. They had just started back to work when Papa's voice sounded from the shop. "Right this way, Mrs. Harris," he was saying. Bess's mother? What was she doing here? Hannah's shoulders tightened. Her mind reached for a wisp of hope. Maybe she wasn't really ignoring me outside the grocery. She was just in a hurry to get home. But another part of her mind was already rebelling. Why do I always do that? Why do I even bother to hope against what I know to be true? Was it because she wanted to believe the best of people? Wouldn't it be easier to expect the worst and not be left heartsick time and time again? But what would that be like, to spend every hour always thinking badly about everyone around her? She considered her choices. She could let Bess and Papa attend to Mrs. Harris. That was surely what Mrs. Harris would want, for Hannah to stay in the background, a hired girl, a servant. Or she could do her work as the future designer and dressmaker of Edmund's Dress Goods. Papa showed Bess's mother into the workroom. She was wearing a dress of brown calico trimmed modestly with narrow red braid. It was nicely made. Hannah had noticed the same about Bess's clothes. Mrs. Harris was a good seamstress, and the red trim was an unexpected touch of style. "Good morning, Mrs. Harris," Hannah said. Mrs. Harris nodded politely, but did not return the greeting. Bess looked up from her work with a broad smile. "Hello, Ma," she said. "Hello, dear," Mrs. Harris said. She turned to Papa. "I hope it's all right for me to come calling before the shop is open. I thought it my responsibility as a parent to see where Bess is working." "Of course," said Papa. "We're glad to have you here, if you'll excuse me." He held up his paintbrush, nodded to Mrs. Harris, and left the room. Hannah cleared her throat. "Bess, would you like to show your mother around a little? I'll make some tea." "Look, Ma, isn't it a nice room for sewing?" Bess was saying as Hannah went into the kitchen. Hannah wasn't sure why she'd offered to make tea, but as she filled the kettle, she remembered yet another axiom of Mama's. For the person who is sour, do something sweet. Even if she couldn't achieve the generosity of spirit practiced by Mama, she could tell herself that she was making tea as a courtesy to Bess. These days, more people were drinking coffee, but Hannah remained steadfast in her loyalty to tea, both green and black. Green tea had been Mama's favorite. As a little girl, Hannah had loved watching the tight, dried leaf buds unfurl in hot water, like tiny fists opening. She loved it still. She liked black tea, too, brewed up strong and brown and gentled with sugar, sometimes with milk, when there was milk to be had. In Los Angeles, Mama's Chinese friends drank only green tea, while Miss Lorna always made the other kind. Hannah had often wondered why everybody didn't drink both. It would be black tea for Mrs. Harris, of course. After a moment's hesitation, Hannah added to the tray a plate with a few of the cookies she had baked for the opening. She carried the tray into the workroom, then invited Bess and her mother to join her. "How nice!" Bess exclaimed. She and her mother sat in the two available chairs. Hannah poured for them, then went to fetch a third chair. "I'll not stand in a corner and wait on them as if I'm a servant. I'll sit down with them, and if she doesn't like it, she can get up and leave." The window on the north side of the building left in full daylight without blazing sun. The workroom was a bright and colorful place, made even more cheerful by Bess's chatter. "Everything you need is to hand," Bess said. "You hardly have to walk more than a step or two." She took a bite of a molasses cookie. Mrs. Harris smiled at her daughter. She sipped her tea and looked around the room. "I must say it is all very nice," she said. "Bess, it is one of your duties. Is one of your duties to clean in here?" Bess looked taken aback. "Oh, no, Ma," she said. "I clear up the scraps and such, but I'm being paid to sew." Immediately, dread began growing in Hannah's heart, for she already knew what Mrs. Harris was about to say. "I'm delighted to find the place so clean and pleasant," Mrs. Harris said. "Thank you," Hannah said. Her hands were suddenly sweaty as thoughts raced through her head. "I should say something. Quick, say it now. Don't think any longer." She opened her mouth and forced out the words. "You sound as if you're surprised, ma'am." "Well, it's just that you hear things." Mrs. Harris waved her hand vaguely. "What kinds of things?" Hannah asked. Once she'd gotten started, she found it easier to keep on. "I'm going to make her say it." "Ma?" Bess said. She glanced first at her mother, then at Hannah, obviously anxious. Hannah felt a flicker of regret on Bess's account, but tamped it down. She was too angry now. I've never said anything of the sort myself, Mrs. Harris said. But a lot of folks think that Chinamen simply don't have the same standards of cleanliness as we do. I'm pleased to see it's not the case here. There, she's gone and said it out loud. Hannah had been called Dirty Chinaman more times than she could count. Usually the cruelty twisted her gut so hard that she could not speak. But she'd finally tired of being angry at herself for that response, so she had spent a lot of time thinking what she should say instead. And now she would say it, with her face blank and her voice as neutral as she could make it. Do you remember the golden spike? She asked, looking directly at Mrs. Harris. Both Mrs. Harris and Bess appeared startled by the sudden change of subject. Well, yes, of course, Miss Harris replied. I was too young, but we learned about it in school, Bess said. The rail lines from the east and the west met in 1869 in Utah Territory. That's right, Hannah said. The rail workers from the east were white. The ones from the west were Chinese. She took a sip of her tea, trying to calm the pounding of her pulse. Over the rim of her cup, she could see that the other two were utterly mystified. The construction supervisor of the Central Pacific Railroad was a man named Mr. Strobridge, she continued. He wrote a report saying that the Chinese camps were cleaner by far than the white men's camps, and that there was much less disease and sickness among the Chinese. And if you're thinking that this is a story the Chinese tell each other, I'll add that my father was one of the railroad's suppliers, and he had it from Mr. Strobridge himself. She had been very young when Papa told her that story, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, and she had never forgotten it. Her voice had remained level, but she could feel that her face was hot. Bess was looking down into her lap. Mrs. Harris glanced somewhere beyond Hannah's head and shifted in her chair, clearly ill at ease. I'm sure I didn't mean to cause offense, she said as she stood. I think I had best be leaving. You needn't see me out. She left the room before Hannah could say another word. Hannah's cheeks were still burning. She knew that she might have lost a customer. Mrs. Harris might well find her impudence cause enough to stay away. Papa would doubtless have a few words to say about that. But at the moment, Hannah was more concerned about Bess. Losing a customer was not nearly as important as losing a friend. Bess was on her feet, having stood and watched her mother's abrupt departure. Hannah looked at her, not sure how to begin. Should she apologize? If she did, would it be insincere? Or it would be insincere. She wasn't a bit sorry for what she'd said. In fact, she was proud of herself for having mustered the courage to say it. A moment later, when Bess turned around, Hannah was surprised to see that her face was almost expressionless. Shall I go on with the skirt tears? Bess asked. Hannah blinked. That wasn't what she'd expected. Maybe she doesn't want to talk about it now, or ever. Yes, that would be fine, unless you'd rather work on something else. Bess shook her head. She sat down, bent over her needle, and began working assiduously. Hannah took up her own needle again. Was it better to pretend nothing had happened and just get on with the work? An awful lot of people dealt with difficulties that way. Hannah was as loath as anyone to talk about disagreeable subjects, but she hated the thought of them lurking, waiting for the moment when they could rear up again.